Hello again, everybody, and welcome to Lecture 10. And today we'll be moving on from the vasculature and now looking at local blood flow. So we'll look at the way that local blood flow to tissues is regulated. Got a couple of jokes to start us off, as always. If you follow the biology Instagram page, you might have seen a couple of these, but bear with me. First, we got great job, 5 stars, a Google review here, and the cake says, "Happy birthday, Dick." Ha ha ha. Don't write that. His name is Matt. And then we got this, we got the Black Mirror, right? Your screen on your phone or your tablet, and it never looks good. And then finally, we got this silly goose here. It says, "When I'm CC'd in an email." We'll begin today by defining local blood flow and then looking at its 4 determinants and their roles in perfusion. In the last lecture, we said that not all the capillaries are filled with blood simultaneously. And that's just because there's not enough blood in the body to fill all those capillaries at the same time. In fact, we said only about a quarter of the capillary beds are open to perfusion of blood, right? So we get a lot of those pre-capillary sphincters that are contracted and closed. Because of this, the blood must be diverted to areas in the body where it's needed most, and therefore it's diverted away from areas where it isn't needed. And it's because of this fact that we must direct blood to where it's needed and away from where it isn't needed that local blood flow is going to vary. We define local blood flow as the amount of blood being delivered locally to the capillaries of a tissue. Okay? We measure the local blood flow in mils per minute, so mils of blood in 1 minute. And our goal here is to maintain adequate perfusion. So perfusion is the means by which blood provides nutrients and removes those cellular waste products. We actually measure it in the amount of blood delivered per unit time per gram of tissue, but more simply, adequate tissue perfusion. That means when our supply meets the demand, and we can then maintain healthy, vital tissues if our supply is meeting our demand with adequate perfusion. Now, this local blood flow is dependent upon a few factors which we're going to walk through here individually. The first is the degree of tissue vascularity, pretty much the amount of vessels that there are within a tissue. The myogenic response, this involves contraction and relaxation of smooth muscle within the vessel. Different local regulatory factors that can alter blood flow. We'll talk about some vasoactive chemicals. And then finally, the total blood flow. That's the amount of blood moving through all the vasculature in the body over a period of time. All right, the first factor that local blood flow is dependent upon is the degree of vascularization. So that's kind of the vessel distribution within a specific tissue. And that's going to determine how much blood we can deliver to that tissue. Okay? And what we see is that organs that have very high metabolic rates have high vascularity. So what I would like for you to do is think of tissues with high vascularity. Okay? So take a minute. Maybe you came up with an example or two. I guess some of the more obvious ones would be the brain and skeletal muscle. And now that we've worked through cardiac unit, the heart as well. And then we also have the liver. So these tissues all have high metabolic needs. They need constant input of oxygen and nutrient. And therefore, they have a high degree of vascularization. So let's think of some tissues now that may have low vascularity. So take a second and think of that. Some structures that have very little vascularity would be the tendons and ligaments, those connective tissues. They're dense, regular connective tissue, and they don't have a lot of vascularity. And then some tissues have no vascularity, and we say that they're avascular. These include things like our epithelial tissues that we talked about earlier, right? They're lining our cavities and our outer body, so no vascularization. Cartilage, those chondrocytes. And then the cornea and the lens of the eye. And remember, that's because it would obscure our vision, and we talked about that last semester. The degree of vascularization can actually change, which brings us to angiogenesis. So just looking at that word, what do you suppose it means? We break it down. We got angio, which means vessel, and genesis, which means production. So you guessed it, angiogenesis is the formation of new vessels. This occurs over a period of weeks to months, and the goal is to keep perfusion adequate when our body changes. So, as a think, pair, share, we got a lot of these today. Can you think of changes where angiogenesis would be necessary? We've talked about one of these more recently. Well, as an example, angiogenesis is stimulated within skeletal muscle in response to increased aerobic training. So we have to deliver more oxygen to that skeletal muscle, and this will stimulate new vessel formation, provides more oxygen to the muscle tissues where it's needed. Another instance would be within adipose tissue. So angiogenesis is going to occur within that adipose connective tissue if we gain a lot of weight in the form of fat deposits. So that new tissue is going to need a blood supply. Oxygen as well, right? Here's another very cool example of angiogenesis. So angiogenesis can occur in response to this slow, gradual occlusion. Remember, that's a blockage of our coronary vessels in the heart. So we can provide an alternative route to deliver blood to the heart itself. So over time, the heart can create its own bypass via angiogenesis. So here we see this occlusion, and then over time we get this collateral artery that is essentially rerouting around this occlusion here. So it provides an alternative blood route, and we call that a collateral artery. And the collaterals then bypass the area of the narrowing and help restore normal blood flow to the heart. Pretty cool. Just as we can have increased vessel formation for an area that's experiencing higher metabolic needs, let's say it's skeletal muscle, if we pick a new aerobic exercise regime, we can have regression of vessels as well. So let's say you started exercising and then you had angiogenesis occur, right? You need to supply those skeletal muscles with more oxygen and nutrients. Then let's say you take on a sedentary lifestyle. So we have this couch potato down here, this image. Well, then we don't need to supply those muscles with much oxygen and nutrients anymore. And that's when we'll experience regression, which is a return to previous state of blood vessels. Okay, we don't need as much oxygen delivered to those tissues anymore. We can also see this if we had a lot of weight gain. As I said in the previous lead, you put on a lot of adipose tissue. That needs a blood supply. But then let's say you start working out and you lose a lot of weight, like in this top image. Well, then we're also going to lose that blood vessel supply to that tissue that no longer exists. Let's apply this concept of angiogenesis then to cancer and tumors. So here we have a mini case study on tumor angiogenesis. So on the left, you can see we have a small tumor. And the trouble arises when that cancerous tumor releases molecules that cause host cells around it to release growth factors that are going to stimulate angiogenesis. So here we can see this sprouting capillary. And in this manner, then that tumor, over time, can get its own blood supply. So cancer cells and tumor cells, just like normal cells in the body, they have metabolic needs. So they're going to need oxygen. They're going to need removal of waste. And the problem arises here when this tumor, this cancerous tumor, gets this blood supply. Well, then we can release cancer cells into the blood, and this is called metastasis. So you've probably heard of metastatic types of cancers. Well, it can enter your blood supply and move to other areas of the body, given this type of angiogenesis. We'll turn now to the myogenic response and its mechanism of control. Systemic blood pressure, so that's the pressure exerted on the arteries when the heart contracts, that's going to change based upon whether we are excited or relaxed. However, the blood flow to tissues can remain constant due to the myogenic response. Recall that the myogenic response is one of the factors that determines local blood flow, or how much blood is delivered to a specific tissue or area. And the myogenic response specifically occurs when smooth muscle within the vessel walls keeps local flow relatively constant. And it does this through small contractions or relaxation of that smooth muscle within that blood vessel. And this is in response to changes in stretch in that vessel wall. So we talked about being excited or relaxing. Okay? And predominantly here we're going to be talking about small arteries and arterioles where we see this myogenic response occur. Let's look at a scenario involving the myogenic response. So let's talk about a sympathetic response here. So if systemic blood pressure rises and more blood enters an arteriole, it's going to stretch. So let's start with that. I'll do a little drawing here. Here's our little arteriole. And this is before the sympathetic response. So we have our initial amount of blood entering and exiting. So that's our primary situation here. Then let's say we have an increase in blood pressure due to this sympathetic response. Okay, so we're getting stronger and faster contractions of the heart, and that is going to lead to more blood being forced through this arteriole. And what's happened then is it's going to distend, right? Okay, so it's going to become wider in response to this increased blood pressure. And the myogenic response then, we're going to see contraction of the smooth muscle within this vessel wall in order to keep the blood flow to that tissue the way it was before this sympathetic response. Okay, so we can see then that it's going to go back to its original diameter, and our blood flow rate is going to return to normal. So we see that with that stretching, that smooth muscle, the arteriole wall, is going to respond by contracting, and that contraction is going to return the flow to the original levels. That's an example of the myogenic response. All right, now let's say we have the alternative scenario, and we have a decrease in systemic blood pressure. Well, there, the amount of blood is going to decrease within that arteriole. So let's draw this scenario again. So let's draw our initial scenario here. We have an arteriole, right? And we have some amount of blood moving through it, okay? But then we're going to have a decrease in blood pressure, perhaps parasympathetic response, okay? And then that's going to mean that there is less blood moving through this vessel than there initially was because there's lower blood pressure, right? So what we're going to do then, and it's key to remember we talked about vasomotor tone. So these vessels, the arterioles, remember they're in a state that is slightly contracted when they're at rest. So what we can do is we can dilate this a little from that state of contraction. We can widen the arterial walls with that smooth muscle. We can dilate, and that's going to increase our blood flow to these initial levels. So that's situation 1, and this is situation 2. Let's look at localized short-term regulation now and the role of vasoactive chemicals. Local blood flow is also dependent upon local regulatory factors that allow for localized short-term regulation. And local flow is regulated based on need. So let's say you're exercising and you need more oxygen, right? So this guy's got that notorious shake weight going here and he's really sweating it up. Or maybe we have some tissue damage and we see, therefore, a localized inflammatory response. Okay? Well, we're going to need more or blood to an area depending upon the issue here, exercising or inflammatory response. And to do this, we use vasoactive chemicals. We can alter blood flow by changing concentrations of certain chemicals. And again, we call these vasoactive chemicals. So vasodilators are chemicals that dilate arterioles and they relax those precapillary sphincters. Remember we talked about? So when we relax those precapillary sphincters, that allows blood to flow into the true capillaries and we increase the flow into those capillary beds. Now, on the other hand, if we have vasoconstrictors, those chemicals, they're going to cause smooth muscle contraction, and they're also going to cause contraction of those precapillary sphincters. And that's going to decrease the flow into capillary beds. So vasoconstrictors will constrict the arteriole, and they will constrict these precapillary sphincters. It's going to allow blood to pass only through this thoroughfare to that post-capillary venule and will bypass the true capillaries. Vasodilators, on the other hand, we're going to dilate the arteriole, and then we're going to open or dilate these precapillary sphincters, allowing blood to move into the entire capillary bed. That brings us now to autoregulation, which is kind of what it sounds like. That prefix auto meaning self, so self-regulation. And this is how tissue itself regulates or controls its own local blood flow. And this is often in response to changing metabolic needs. So let's say we're talking about a response to inadequate perfusion of a tissue due to increased metabolic activity. Well, when tissue activity increases, there's stimuli that are released that signal that there's inadequate perfusion, and then they can act as vasodilators. So what do you think chemical changes could be seen at the level of the tissues that would signal inadequate perfusion and then kick off the vasodilation? What chemical changes could then be seen at the level of the tissues? Well, if the tissue is not adequately perfused, then we're going to see a decline in oxygen and nutrient levels. And simultaneously, there's going to be an increase in carbon dioxide, lactic acid, and hydrogen ion. Those local changes in that chemical environment, they can act as local vasodilators. So they act as a stimulus to cause dilation within those arterioles. And therefore, we can return the local blood levels to where they need to be to get adequate perfusion. And as those tissues then become adequately perfused, those stimuli that we had, such as low oxygen, high CO2, those are going to return to normal levels. And that's going to act as a negative feedback response to constrict the vessels back to their normal diameters in order to maintain homeostasis. Autoregulation is most apparent when we temporarily disrupt blood supply to an area and then restore it. When we disrupt the blood supply, that tissue is deprived of things it needs like oxygen and nutrients, and then at the same time, metabolic wastes accumulate. When we restore local blood flow to that area, we're going to see an increase in blood flow. Okay? And we call that reactive hyperemia. We have additional blood supply there to quickly supply oxygen and nutrients and help remove those wastes that have accumulated. A great example of reactive hyperemia that we can all relate to, being Minnesotans or at least attending school in Minnesota, is when we entered the classroom after walking outside in the winter between classes, and your cheeks turned that bright red color. So when you were outside and it was cold, the blood vessels within your dermis, they constricted, and they're moving blood away from the skin, the dermis, through that arteriovenous shunt we talked about, or the arteriovenous anastomosis, which we finished up with in the last lecture. Help conserve body heat, right? And then when you leave that cold and enter the classroom, that reddish color of your cheeks is due to increased blood flow to the dermis. That's that reactive hyperemia. We've been depriving that area of the skin we've been depriving nutrients and oxygen, and we've been building up these metabolic wastes, CO2, right? Lactic acid or hydrogen ions. And we need to increase the blood flow to that area to kind of restore it. So we have these bright red cheeks periodically, making up for that lost time, if you will. And we'll finish today talking about the inflammatory response that occurs with tissue damage, and then the relationship between local and total blood flow. And finally, we'll talk about short-term regulation due to damaged tissues. So local blood flow is also regulated when vasoactive chemicals are released when tissue is damaged. Let's say, hypothetically, you're stung by a yellow jacket here. Well, due to that trauma, we're going to see that histamine and bradykinin, two vasoactive chemicals we've talked about before, they're going to cause arterioles to dilate. So they're vasodilators. And this is going to be in response to trauma, allergy, infection, even exercise can lead to the release of these chemicals. Okay. The reason this causes localized swelling, so we get vasodilation, we get increased blood flow to that area, which causes swelling. And along with that blood, we're carrying the cells of the immune system, hopefully to kill any bacteria or anything that's coming in with that trauma. Now, Interestingly, histamine and bradykinin, for example, they can also stimulate release of nitrous oxide, another vasodilator. So this can also help increase swelling or blood flow to that area.